The door wasn't just unlocked, it was hanging halfway open, as if someone walked in with confidence and left with no fear of being caught. That was the first thing that froze the neighbor in place. Karen didn't miss work. She didn't skip routine. And she definitely didn't leave her front door open in a neighborhood that trusted too easily. Her car sat in the driveway, untouched, betraying the lie she never told. She was still here. Somewhere. The morning sun hit her windshield like it was trying to wake her up, but the house behind it felt wrong. The silence inside wasn't peaceful. It felt like someone had pressed pause on life itself. No movement, no response, no hint of a struggle, just an emptiness that felt intentional. As the neighbor stepped inside, the smell of still air mixed with a sharp feeling that something was out of place. A mug sat on the counter, half full. A lamp was left on. Her keys sat where she usually dropped them. Nothing screamed chaos, yet everything felt off. A presence lingered. Someone had walked through these rooms with calm, steady steps, making choices that only someone confident in their control would dare to make. Upstairs, a faint draft pushed down the hallway, like the house itself was exhaling a warning. The neighbor hesitated near the bedroom door, heart pounding, sensing that whatever happened here had already changed everything. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The bedroom wasn't trashed. That's what made it worse. It looked like someone had been careful, too careful. The sheets were wrinkled in a way that didn't match sleep. The pillows were shifted just enough to suggest movement, but not enough to suggest panic. A drawer was nudged open, not pulled. A shoe lay on its side near the closet, but nothing else suggested a frantic moment. This wasn't the aftermath of chaos. This felt like a message. Karen's perfume lingered faintly in the air, mixing with a heavy quiet that made the room feel smaller than it was. A chair near the window was slightly turned, facing the wall, not the view, as if someone sat there waiting for the perfect moment. The neighbor's eyes scanned everything, looking for the slightest hint of where Karen might be or what she might have gone through. Instead, all they found were clues too clean to trust. A blanket on the floor was folded inward, almost as if it had been handled by someone trying not to leave anything behind. A strand of hair on the dresser didn't belong to the neighbor, and the air felt thick with something no one wanted to name. The room didn't just feel wrong. It felt staged, not to tell the truth, but to hide it. Downstairs, the silence still waited. But up here, the truth was hiding in plain sight, whispering that whoever did this wasn't in a hurry, because they believed they wouldn't be caught. When they finally reached the back of the room, the moment hit like a blow to the chest. A presence, heavy, unmoving, final, waited behind the bed. Karen lay there, still, frozen in a way that told a story no one was prepared to hear. Her hand was stretched slightly outward, as if she reached for help that never came. Her hair was draped across her shoulder, and her expression held a quiet fear that felt like it never had the chance to turn into a scream. The light from the window brushed across her face, highlighting the unfairness of a life interrupted by someone who walked into her home without hesitation. The neighbor staggered back, breath stolen, everything ringing with disbelief. The body didn't just reveal a tragedy, it revealed precision. No overturned furniture, no frantic struggle, no loud collapse. Just a quiet ending carried out by someone who knew exactly how to control the moment. Every second in that room turned heavier. Every breath felt wrong. Every heartbeat echoed the same horrifying truth. Someone had been here. Someone had watched her. Someone had decided how this story would end. And they walked out feeling untouchable. The first responders moved through the hallway in quiet shock. No one said it out loud, but the room's stillness told them everything. This wasn't random. This wasn't desperate. This was calculated. As the news spread to Karen's coworkers, her family, her neighbor who found her, The pain hit like a wave. Some cried, others couldn't speak, and a few stood there gripping their own arms just to stop their hands from shaking. The house, once warm and familiar, now felt like a monument to a nightmare no one saw coming. Outside, people gathered with trembling voices, asking the questions that never have easy answers. How could this happen? Who would do something like this? Was she targeted? No one had answers, but everyone felt the same cold truth settle over them. If someone could walk into Karen's home so calmly, who else could be next? The fear spread fast, not because the killer vanished, but because they moved like someone who believed no one would ever catch them. If stories like this shake you to your core, subscribe now. Because if you forget, the next time a real-life predator walks past your door, you'll wish you never ignored warnings like this. The officers arrived with the brisk professionalism of routine, unaware that this case would defy every expectation. The front door creaked as it closed behind them, echoing through the house like a hollow warning. The living room looked untouched, almost ordinary, but every ordinary detail now carried weight. A coffee mug half full, a newspaper folded neatly on the table, signs of life frozen mid-action. The officers scanned the room quickly, their eyes trained to spot obvious signs of a struggle, yet the subtle indicators of intrusion, carefully placed by someone who knew the house intimately, slipped through unnoticed. They moved through the kitchen, calling out Karen's name, hearing only the soft hum of the refrigerator. A floorboard creaked underfoot, and the officers flinched, each sound magnified by tension. Upstairs, the bedroom door loomed like a barrier to answers they didn't yet understand. Inside, the bed was slightly disheveled, the sheets ruffled in a way that suggested movement, but not panic. The dresser drawer was open just enough to hint at disturbance, yet the items inside remained untouched, creating confusion. Every detail seemed contradictory, normal yet off, calm yet deliberate. Detective Victor Albright, pacing slowly, felt an instinctive unease. He knew that the smallest oversight here could cost weeks, months, even years of progress. Yet in those early hours, even seasoned eyes missed the crucial hints. A faint scuff on the floor, a strand of hair not Karen's, the subtle positioning of the furniture that hinted at calculation. The officers logged each observation, unaware that the clues they dismissed were the threads that would later unravel the timeline. The house didn't scream chaos. It whispered control, and in that whisper, the predator's confidence was unmistakable. A chilling reminder that those who strike quietly often strike hardest. The streets of Kalamazoo's south side were quiet that Monday morning, but inside the neighborhood, confusion and fear brewed beneath the surface. Officers went door to door, clipboard in hand, knocking politely while expecting clarity. Instead, they were met with hesitations, half-answers, and conflicting stories that seemed to clash at every turn. One neighbor insisted she had seen Karen leave for errands late Sunday afternoon. Another claimed the apartment had been dark and silent all day. Timelines fractured, memories blurred, and the investigators felt the familiar frustration of chasing shadows. Witnesses described a dark sedan driving slowly down the street, yet details diverged dramatically. Some remembered its make and model, others could only recall its vague color. One neighbor insisted she saw a man near the apartment late at night, while another swore no one had come or gone. Each statement, recorded meticulously, created a tangled web of possibilities, forcing the detectives to question every assumption. The community, normally tight-knit, now seemed distant, unsure, even defensive. Fear had transformed neighbors into unreliable narrators of their own streets. Amid the uncertainty, a young woman, Dana Prescott, recalled something she had almost dismissed. A shadowed figure, moving near Karen's apartment, fleeting and unrecognizable. Her recollection, though hesitant, hinted at the predator's careful movements, a presence in plain sight that no one truly noticed. Every vague detail added both hope and frustration, yet no single account provided the clarity needed to break the case open. The detectives were left balancing multiple conflicting stories, knowing that the wrong interpretation could steer the investigation off course. In those first 48 hours, the neighborhood itself became both witness and obstacle. Streets that had once felt familiar now seemed foreign. The community's uncertainty mirrored the investigators' own. Amid polite answers and nervous glances, one truth remained undeniable. Someone moved through these homes, invisible yet lethal, and the clock was already ticking. Amid the confusion of witness statements and scattered clues, Wayne Pierce emerged as a calm, cooperative presence. A local mechanic known in the community, he arrived at the apartment complex claiming concern for Karen, emphasizing how punctual and reliable she had always been. His demeanor was steady, almost reassuring a man who seemed trustworthy in a moment of chaos. He offered his own observations with practiced care. He had seen nothing unusual on his way home the night before, he said, and he volunteered to answer any questions the officers had. Every word was measured, every gesture intentional, as if he were aware of exactly how to be helpful without drawing suspicion. Pierce's alibi was immediately taken at face value. He described working late at his shop and corroborated it with his wife, whose statements seemed convincing. Detectives, exhausted from the whirlwind of conflicting neighborhood accounts, allowed themselves to trust this cooperative face. Yet subtle inconsistencies slipped through unnoticed: a glance toward the hallway, a pause when asked about small details, a casual phrasing that didn't quite fit the timeline. It was almost imperceptible. But to anyone trained in deception, a pattern was hiding beneath his normalcy. By stepping forward, Pierce shifted the focus. Investigators began to rely on his account, Loam, a gem, reducing suspicion and inadvertently masking other critical clues. The impression he left was powerful. Someone who belonged, someone relatable, someone harmless. Yet in reality, every piece of information he provided was carefully calibrated to misdirect. In these first crucial hours, the predator's strategy became evident: appear as a helper while concealing the truth in plain sight. The investigators left that afternoon with detailed notes, a false sense of progress, and no idea that the man they thanked for his cooperation was weaving a protective web around himself. At this early stage, the seeds of deception had been planted, and the real story remained buried beneath the surface of trust and routine. By the end of the first 48 hours, the investigation was already faltering. Officers had catalogued every observation, typed up every neighbor's contradictory statement, and logged Wayne Pierce's cooperative testimony. Yet the threads of truth were slipping through their fingers. The small clues that mattered: a faint scuff on the hallway floor, a misplaced item in the bedroom, a shadow glimpsed from the street, were either overlooked or deemed insignificant. In their rush to establish a timeline, the investigators unknowingly allowed critical evidence to fade into the background. The city, still reeling from the initial shock, looked for answers. Coworkers of Karen expressed worry and confusion. Her absence weighed heavily on her circle of friends and family. Officers returned to the station exhausted, only to realize that the first 2 days had yielded no solid leads. Every effort to reconstruct Karen's last movements collided with uncertainty, and early assumptions formed in the absence of clarity now threatened to misdirect the case entirely. The investigation had begun under pressure, and in that pressure, mistakes were made, and details were dismissed that would later prove invaluable. Even Wayne Pierce's alibi, once taken as reassuring, now loomed with subtle ambiguity. The investigators did not yet recognize the precision with which he had presented himself. Calm, cooperative, and strategically credible. He had embedded himself seamlessly into the narrative, redirecting attention and shaping perception without detection. By the close of the second day, the house remained quiet. The streets, unremarkable, and the sense of urgency weighed heavily on everyone involved. The truth, buried in plain sight, was slipping further from reach. In those first 48 hours, opportunity was lost, and the predator had already secured his advantage, leaving the investigators chasing shadows in a city that would not yet understand the danger lingering in its midst. Detective Victor Albright stared at the tiny vial resting in the evidence locker, the biological sample almost laughably small against the harsh fluorescent light. A sliver of material, barely the size of a pinhead, held the key to an entire investigation. In theory, it could unlock the identity of the predator who shattered Karen Umphrey's life, but in 1992, theory rarely translated into reality. The technology simply wasn't capable of producing a full profile from something so fragile. Every day that passed without an answer magnified the impossibility of the task, pressing down on the investigators with an invisible weight. The initial hope of a breakthrough quickly gave way to frustration. Lab technicians ran tests, carefully preserving what little existed, but the results were incomplete, often inconclusive. Even the most cutting-edge forensic methods of the time were blunt instruments against such precise evidence. Albright could only catalog the limited findings, aware that the smallest misstep could destroy the sample forever. It wasn't just a test of science, it was a test of patience, endurance, and the ability to hope when the odds were stacked against them. Meanwhile, the team began piecing together the early fragments of a timeline, but every clue seemed tenuous, like threads fraying in their hands. The DNA sample held potential, yet its full power was locked away, inaccessible for decades. In the quiet of the lab, Albright felt the same ache he had experienced upon entering Karen's apartment, the gap between what should be and what was. A critical lead existed, yet it mocked them with its elusiveness. In those hours, frustration rippled through the team. Hope collided with helplessness. The tiny vial, so unassuming, was the bridge between justice and failure. And every moment it remained unanalyzed, the predator continued to exist beyond reach. Its presence, a silent threat, reminding everyone that the most dangerous criminals are the ones who leave only whispers behind. News of Karen Umphrey's disappearance spread quickly through Kalamazoo, and the city's quiet streets carried an invisible tension. Coworkers whispered at the office, their eyes darting to empty chairs and unfinished tasks. Friends of Karen struggled to make sense of a life interrupted, replaying every interaction, every encounter, hoping to spot a clue they hadn't noticed before. Fear was no longer abstract. It had taken physical form, in every glance, every hesitant step through familiar streets. Neighbors locked doors, double-checked windows, and watched the roads with suspicion. The realization that a predator had moved through their community, unknown and undetected, left a lingering unease. Small, mundane actions, walking the dog, picking up groceries, stepping outside to greet a neighbor, suddenly felt dangerous. The sense of safety that once defined the neighborhood eroded rapidly, replaced by a cautious wariness that seeped into homes, offices, and schools. Even casual conversations carried tension. People speculated. Theories spread quickly, right-edids, and the unknown became a psychological weight pressing on everyone. Every unfamiliar car on the street, every shadow in a window, ignited the imagination and amplified anxiety. Children were watched more closely, and neighbors who once nodded politely now avoided eye contact, their minds racing through scenarios of danger. Detectives could feel the pressure from all sides. Friends and family demanded answers, while the community's fear mounted with each day. The invisible predator's presence was felt everywhere, yet remained frustratingly untouchable. Every person questioned, "I weigh him." Every tip received seemed to confirm a simple, terrifying truth. Someone capable of cruelty walked freely among them, and until the investigation yielded results, the entire community would continue to hold its collective breath, living in quiet, suffocating uncertainty. The local press quickly picked up Karen Umphrey's disappearance, and what began as factual reporting soon morphed into a frenzy of speculation. Headlines screamed for attention: "Woman vanishes from quiet Kalamazoo street," and "Predator on the loose." Every broadcast and newspaper column seemed to heighten the anxiety already gripping the community. Residents who once moved freely now hesitated, wary of the unknown force that the media magnified. Reports often contradicted one another. Some accounts painted Karen's last moments in ominous detail, while others focused on the chaos of the investigation. Minor inconsistencies in witness statements became fodder for dramatic storytelling, feeding fear more than providing clarity. Every new article seemed to heighten the sense that danger was not only real but constantly present. Families whispered warnings to one another. Neighbors scrutinized strangers, and the community's collective trust began to erode. Amid this storm of information, detectives faced an additional challenge, separating fact from exaggeration. Each rumor required verification. Every sensational claim demanded investigation. The media's coverage, while keeping the case alive, also amplified pressure on the team. Calls from concerned citizens flooded the station. Tips poured in from strangers, some sincere, others misleading. The line between helpful information and distracting noise blurred, making it more difficult to focus on the tangible clues that could lead to answers. Despite the chaos, one truth remained clear. The predator's presence loomed larger than ever. The combination of media attention and community fear created a pressure cooker environment. While the press stoked anxiety, the investigators quietly acknowledged that the only path forward required patience, precision, and unwavering attention to the tiny fragments of evidence that might one day pierce through the fog. The threads of truth were thin, delicate, and at risk of snapping under the weight of public hysteria. As the first week of the investigation drew to a close, Detective Albright and his team confronted the harsh reality. The clues they possessed were fragile, scattered, and frustratingly incomplete. The DNA sample, once a beacon of hope, remained untouchable by 1992 standards. Every test yielded only partial results, leaving investigators to stare at a tiny vial of potential answers, powerless to unlock its secrets. The frustration was suffocating. Each passing day amplified the gap between knowing a killer existed and knowing who he was. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers pored over their notes, retracing steps, re-interviewing witnesses, and revisiting the apartment for anything overlooked. The early inconsistencies, small overlooked details, and contradictory accounts now felt like a weight pressing down on the investigation. Every theory was tentative, every lead provisional, and yet, the predator moved unseen. Will Breasted, and Rhea, shielded by the very normalcy of his life, a ghost in plain sight. Outside the station, the community's anxiety intensified. Coworkers, friends, and neighbors whispered about what might have happened, each speculation further distorting reality. The fear that someone capable of violence was walking freely through the streets created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. People double-checked locks, avoided empty streets at night, and exchanged anxious glances at every unfamiliar car or passerby. The emotional strain of uncertainty became as palpable as the investigation itself. For Detective Albright, the weight was personal. Every dead end, every inconclusive result, deepened his resolve, but also gnawed at his sense of control. The threads of truth felt thinner by the hour, fragile as they strained against the tide of confusion and fear. The case, once a straightforward search for a missing woman, had become a delicate balancing act between hope and despair. And in that tension, the predator remained beyond reach, silently asserting that even the strongest thread could fray under pressure. In the months following Karen Umphrey's disappearance, the intensity that had gripped Kalamazoo began to wane. News coverage shifted to fresher stories, and the public, hungry for resolution, moved on. The once buzzing community, rife with speculation and whispered warnings, grew quiet. Karen's absence remained painfully real to her family and close friends, but for many others, her story became a memory fading into the background of everyday life. Detectives continued their work, but the lack of public pressure altered the atmosphere at the station. Calls from concerned neighbors became sporadic, and the media's glare dimmed. What was once a citywide conversation transformed into occasional mentions in local papers and brief segments on regional news. The urgency that had once pressed on officers' shoulders dissipated, leaving a subtle but powerful void. This fading attention allowed the predator to recede further into the background. Without public eyes constantly watching, every ordinary action, commuting, running errands, attending community events, became a shield of normalcy for someone who should have been under scrutiny. The danger that had gripped the streets with immediacy was no longer visible, but it had not disappeared. It lingered quietly, a hidden threat waiting behind the calm. For Amelia Umphrey, the fading attention was crushing in a different way. Every news report that skipped her sister's case, every conversation that ignored her grief, reinforced the feeling of isolation. The world moved on, while the truth remained locked away. As public interest dwindled, the investigation slowed, and the threads that might have led to answers frayed further, leaving Karen's disappearance to echo in silence rather than headlines. In the early days, investigators had chased every lead, no matter how minor. Witnesses were questioned, neighbors re-interviewed, and Karen's routines examined in painstaking detail. But as weeks turned into months, the initial flurry of activity slowed. Tips that once seemed promising crumbled under scrutiny. Names that had briefly surfaced as potential suspects were cleared, alibis verified, and the few clues that might have pointed the way dissolved into uncertainty. Detective Albright and his team pored over the evidence repeatedly, aware that every small oversight could cost them justice. They returned to the apartment, scanned the neighborhood, and reviewed statements from coworkers, friends, and neighbors. But the results were frustratingly inconclusive. Even Wayne Pierce, who had presented himself as a cooperative figure in the early investigation, continued to occupy a gray area. His account, once considered solid, now sat under quiet suspicion, but there was no proof to act upon. Each dead end was a blow to the investigators' morale. The DNA sample, their most promising piece of physical evidence, remained unhelpful in 1992, unable to produce a match. Officers who had hoped for a breakthrough now found themselves retracing familiar paths without progress. Every lead that fizzled left the team with a growing awareness. The case was slipping from their grasp. The shadows of unproven possibilities began to dominate both the investigation and the community's imagination. What might have been an active pursuit of justice was slowly morphing into a waiting game. For every unanswered question, the predator remained one step removed, unseen and untouchable. The hope of early resolution faded, replaced by the unsettling reality that the threads connecting them to the truth were tenuous, fragile, and fraying under the weight of time. As days turned to weeks, then months, the weight of Karen's disappearance pressed most heavily on her sister, Amelia. Each morning began with the same agonizing thought. Karen was not coming home. Candlelight vigils, organized to honor her memory, became a ritual of endurance rather than hope. Amelia moved through her days with an invisible burden, replaying every memory, every conversation with Karen, searching for signs she might have missed, wondering if she could have done something to prevent the tragedy. The uncertainty gnawed at her relentlessly. Questions with no answers. Why Karen? Who did this? How could someone act so cruelly and vanish without trace? Became constant companions. Friends and neighbors tried to offer comfort, but the truth was raw, isolating, and impossible to share fully. Amelia felt the slow erosion of hope, a quiet, persistent ache that did not demand attention but consumed her nonetheless. The police continued their investigation, yet even their reassurance offered only fleeting relief. Each inconclusive lead or unhelpful tip reinforced the sense that justice might never come. The frustration of not knowing who had violated her sister's life, and in turn, their family's sense of safety, became a daily torment. Amelia's grief intertwined with anger, sadness, and helplessness. The world moved forward around her, but she remained suspended in a liminal space, caught between a past that had been shattered and a future clouded with uncertainty. Within the family home, silence became a constant presence, louder than any conversation. Amelia's vigil for her sister was no longer just a search for justice. It was a fight to keep Karen's memory alive against the oppressive weight of fading attention. Every unanswered question, every empty day, magnified the absence, shaping a grief that felt eternal. As months became years, the Karen Umphrey case settled into a quiet dormancy. The frantic urgency of the investigation gave way to routine, and eventually, the case was labeled cold. For the community of Kalamazoo, life resumed, but a subtle, lingering tension remained. People locked doors a little tighter, hesitated before walking alone at night, and cast wary glances at strangers' fear that had transformed from immediate alarm into an unspoken, ever-present shadow. Within the police department, the cold case file gathered dust on shelves, the DNA sample stored carefully yet untouchable by the era's technology. Detectives moved on to other cases, carrying the weight of an unresolved crime like an invisible scar. The silence of unanswered questions became a threat in itself, a reminder that someone capable of violence was still out there, untouched by law or consequence. For Amelia, the silence was deafening. Annual vigils became a ritual of remembrance, but they were also a stark acknowledgement that the truth had slipped just beyond reach. The unanswered questions gnawed at her resolve, each quiet day amplifying the despair. Friends and extended family offered support, yet nothing could replace the certainty of justice. The absence of resolution left the family vulnerable, emotionally exposed to a predator who had slipped away into the folds of normal life. In Kalamazoo, the city's pulse returned to ordinary rhythms. Yet the echo of fear never fully disappeared. The quiet streets, the everyday routines, the casual greetings, all became subtle reminders of the unseen danger that had once walked among them. In the stillness, the community was forced to acknowledge an unsettling reality. Even as the world moved on, the predator remained unaccounted for, a living testament to the fragility of safety and the enduring impact of unresolved violence. The evidence locker was quiet, almost reverent, except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Detective Victor Albright stood before the small, unassuming vial, its contents nearly invisible, yet carrying the weight of decades. This tiny sample, the last tangible trace of Karen Umphrey's attacker, was a reminder of both promise and failure. Every time he looked at it, Albright felt the sting of impotence, the frustration of justice delayed. He recalled the crime scene in vivid detail. The overturned furniture, the partially completed crossword, the way Karen's life had been stolen in a few brutal hours. That memory fueled a relentless need to revisit the vial, to see if science had finally caught up to human cruelty. Day after day, he returned to the evidence room, carefully examining the label, the date, the fragile sample inside. The vial sat like a specter of guilt, reminding him that for every hour of investigation, the killer remained free, invisible, unpunished. Albright sometimes imagined what it would be like if the sample could speak, if it could reveal the face of the man who had vanished into the shadows of normalcy. Each unsuccessful attempt to extract information only intensified his obsession. Colleagues noticed the strain etched into his features, the quiet mutterings when no one was listening. Yet the detective pressed on, driven not by hope of recognition, but by a moral imperative he could not ignore. The biological sample was more than evidence. It was a symbol of the case itself, a silent, persistent question that demanded an answer. And though technology in the early 1990s failed him, Albright treated it as a patient companion, believing that one day the vial would reveal its secret. Until then, it was the ghost in the locker, haunting him with every tick of the clock, every passing day that left Karen's family waiting for justice that seemed endlessly postponed. The case began to consume Detective Albright. Nights were the hardest. While the city slept, he pored over notes, revisited interview transcripts, and examined photographs of Karen's apartment with a scrutiny that verged on mania. Sleep became a luxury. The line between day and night blurred as he chased a justice that refused to appear. Friends and family noticed the change, the furrowed brow, the hollowed eyes, but they could not understand the magnitude of his fixation. Albright's obsession extended beyond the office. At home, he replayed every step of the investigation, dissecting the decisions made in 1992. He questioned every action. Could a different question have elicited a critical detail? Was there a clue overlooked, buried in plain sight? Every memory carried weight. Every uncertainty became a stone added to the burden on his shoulders. The detective's isolation grew. Conversations felt hollow, laughter uncomfortable, and normal life a distraction he could scarcely afford. Colleagues offered updates, but reports of another unresolved lead only fueled his frustration. Albright's mind circled the same questions endlessly, tethered to the biological sample that had become both his compass and his tormentor. Even as decades passed, he maintained the same rituals. The vial was never far from view when he worked. It rested on the edge of his desk, a constant companion. The presence of the sample reminded him of Karen, of Amelia's unwavering hope, and of the quiet horror that a killer had walked free. Every day that justice remained unrealized was another day the detective felt he had failed not only the victim, but the community he had sworn to protect. Alone, sleepless, and haunted, Albright carried the weight of a case that had refused resolution, allowing guilt to entwine with dedication. The vial was a ghost, but it was also a lifeline, a fragile, unforgiving reminder that until the case was solved, he could never rest. By 1998, advances in forensic science had finally offered a glimmer of hope. Techniques that were unavailable in 1992 now promised the possibility of extracting more detailed DNA profiles from older samples. Albright approached the evidence locker with cautious optimism, carrying the same small vial that had been his obsession for years. The potential breakthrough was tantalizing finally, a chance to connect the biological trace to a living person, to reveal the face behind decades of unanswered questions. The sample was carefully transported to the state laboratory, where technicians reanalyzed it using the latest methods. Albright observed from a distance, his mind racing with both hope and fear. Could this finally be the moment where time, technology, and persistence intersected to deliver justice? Or would the results once again deepen the frustration, leaving the community and him in an agonizing limbo? Hours later, the report arrived. The DNA profile was more complete, far more detailed than the crude sample of 1,992. Yet the result brought no relief. When entered into CODIS, the system produced the same crushing outcome: no match. The killer remained unidentified, his presence still a shadow over Kalamazoo. Albright stared at the printout, a mix of exhaustion, anger, and helplessness washing over him. The hope that had surged with modern technology crumbled like fragile glass, leaving him with nothing but the same unanswered questions and an even heavier sense of responsibility. The 1,998 rerun became another chapter in a long story of failure and endurance. The biological sample, now more refined and complete, remained as elusive as ever. It mocked both the limits of technology and the persistence of human effort. For Albright, it was a bitter lesson. Sometimes the most advanced tools cannot force justice to arrive, and the ghost in the locker continued to haunt him, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what might never be found. Even as the years passed, the biological sample remained a haunting presence in Detective Albright's life. Every glance at the vial, every memory of Karen Umphrey's final hours, carried with it a surge of guilt. He questioned his decisions, the paths chosen and those abandoned, wondering if a single misstep had allowed the killer to vanish into the safety of anonymity. The weight of responsibility pressed relentlessly against his conscience. Albright's obsession began to blur the boundary between duty and personal torment. He could not ignore the image of Karen's family. Their grief, their unanswered questions, their fragile hope that each year might finally bring resolution. Each anniversary, each failed lead, intensified his sense of failure. The detective's identity became inseparable from the case, his life defined not by victories, but by the persistent absence of closure. The community, once alert and fearful, slowly acclimated to the unresolved nature of the crime. Yet for Albright, the passage of time offered no comfort. The vial in the evidence locker was more than DNA. It was a mirror, reflecting decades of persistence, missed opportunities, and the unrelenting shadow of what might have been. It reminded him that justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is agony prolonged for those who waited and those who swore to protect them. As the detective stood before the sample late one night, he understood that the ghost of the evidence was both curse and guide. It drove his relentless pursuit, fed his guilt, and anchored him to the hope that science would one day catch up to human cruelty. Until that moment arrived, the biological trace would remain the silent witness to his lifelong struggle, a stark emblem of the unresolved, a reminder that some shadows refuse to be forgotten. After the initial chaos faded, Wayne Pierce resumed a life that seemed ordinary, blending seamlessly into Kalamazoo's routines. He was the same mechanic neighbors greeted daily, the man who fixed their cars, exchanged small talk, and waved at familiar faces. On the surface, he was unremarkable, a figure of stability and neighborly courtesy. Yet behind the calm exterior lay a chilling truth. The man responsible for Karen Umphrey's death continued to walk freely, untouched by consequence. The community, unaware of the predator's ongoing presence, gradually settled back into their daily rhythms. Children played in yards where adults once whispered suspicions. Streets returned to quiet routines. The terrifying thought of danger lurking nearby became a background noise, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet always present. Every friendly smile, every familiar handshake, carried a hidden tension for those who remembered the unresolved crime. Albright, though still on the force, could not escape the knowledge of who Pierce truly was. He imagined how the killer's normal life unfolded. Evenings spent quietly in his home, errands run in plain sight, casual conversations that betrayed no hint of past violence. Each thought was a reminder that justice had been delayed, not by chance, but by circumstances that favored concealment. The predator's ability to hide in plain sight deepened the psychological weight of the case. Fear persisted in whispers and glances, a subtle tension threading through the city. The community's collective vigilance dulled over time, a dangerous complacency forming as life moved forward. Yet for those attuned to the darkness, the knowledge remained. Sometimes, the most dangerous individuals are not strangers, but those you trust or simply pass by every day. Amelia Umphrey carried a grief that refused to fade. Each day reminded her of her sister's absence, the laughter that no longer echoed, the unanswered questions that lingered in every quiet corner of her home. Therapy became a necessary refuge, a place to untangle the tight knots of sorrow, guilt, and lingering fear. Yet even in those sessions, the weight of uncertainty was palpable, a constant shadow that no words could fully dispel. She wrestled with anger and helplessness. Friends and coworkers tried to offer comfort, but the emptiness was uniquely hers. The city moved forward, seasons changed, and yet Amelia felt suspended in a time loop where the most basic question, who had taken her sister, remained unanswered. Every news report, every mention of cold cases, triggered a pang of anxiety that refused to soften with age. At night, she would walk past the places her sister had loved, replaying memories in her mind and examining each detail for clues that could never be found. The trauma wasn't just the violent act, it was the decades of silence and waiting that followed. Each year marked another layer of isolation, as friends accepted that closure might never arrive. Despite this, Amelia clung to fragments of hope. Candlelight vigils, letters to law enforcement, and quiet acts of remembrance became her rituals of resilience. She refused to allow Karen's memory to be lost to obscurity, though every act of remembrance reminded her of the persistent void. The psychological toll was immense, and yet, like a steadfast flame, she held on to the belief that one day the truth would surface, that justice even delayed was possible. Detective Victor Albright's career ended under the weight of the Karen Umphrey case. Decades of relentless pursuit, endless nights analyzing evidence, and the constant reminder of a killer walking free had taken their toll. Retirement was not a relief, it was a resignation to the limits of his efforts. The city had moved on, but he could not. Each corner of Kalamazoo carried memories of unanswered questions and a haunting sense of unfinished business. Albright reflected on the choices he had made over the years. Every interview, every follow-up lead, every decision to prioritize certain clues over others replayed in his mind. He questioned whether a single different action could have altered the course of events. The guilt was persistent, gnawing at him even as he packed up his office. The biological sample, once a symbol of hope, remained a silent witness to decades of frustration and failure. At home, Albright struggled to adjust. Simple routines felt hollow, social interactions strained. His mind remained tethered to the case, the unanswered questions looping endlessly. The sense of duty that had fueled his career now became a burden, a constant reminder of the justice that had yet to arrive. He carried the knowledge that the killer, indistinguishable from the community, continued life uninterrupted, while he, who had devoted years to catching him, could only watch from a distance. Colleagues and friends offered sympathy, but words could not lighten the weight of his conscience. Albright's retirement was not a closure. It was a continuation of the struggle in another form, a quiet battle against helplessness and the passage of time. Though no longer officially on the case, he remained connected, vigilant, and haunted, embodying the deep emotional cost of a cold case that had defined his life. Over the years, Kalamazoo slowly settled into a fragile sense of normalcy. Residents continued their routines, running errands, attending school events, and going to work, all while carrying a quiet awareness of the unresolved crime that had shaken their city. The initial panic faded, replaced by a muted vigilance, a subtle, almost subconscious acknowledgement that answers might never come. Neighborhood conversations grew less frequent about Karen Umphrey's disappearance. Candlelight vigils became smaller, the media mentions rare and brief. The case, once headline news, became a quiet story of absence and lingering fear. Yet for those who remembered, the sense of unease never completely disappeared. The predator, unrecognized and undisturbed, lived alongside them, a constant shadow in plain sight. Families who had once felt safe began to realize that the threat had not disappeared. It had simply been hidden. Parents silently cautioned children about strangers, neighbors exchanged wary glances at unfamiliar faces, and the community's collective anxiety, though softened, persisted beneath the surface of everyday life. The fear was no longer explosive, but it was persistent, a quiet hum in the background of daily existence. Amelia Umphrey and Detective Albright remained symbols of unresolved grief and professional dedication. Their vigilance reminded the city that justice could not always be rushed, and that the absence of answers carried its own heavy toll. In the quiet acceptance of uncertainty, Kalamazoo learned to live with fear that had no face, to carry a story without resolution, and to navigate daily life while never forgetting the girl whose absence marked the city forever. Investigator Miles Ashton stepped into the cold case files with a quiet intensity. Fresh from years of solving active cases, he carried a reputation for patience and precision, a methodical approach that allowed him to see what others overlooked. The Karen Umphrey file, dusty and worn, arrived on his desk like a weight he couldn't ignore. Ashton understood the burden of inheriting a decades-old investigation. Hopes had long faded, evidence had degraded, and the killer had walked freely for over 30 years. Ashton spread the folders across his office, the faded photographs and typed reports, a haunting reminder of the life lost and the questions left unanswered. Each page was a window into a moment frozen in time, interviews recorded with urgency yet lacking the scrutiny that modern methods demanded. He noticed patterns in the testimonies, contradictions in timelines, and small inconsistencies that had escaped the attention of the original investigators. It was in these overlooked details that Ashton found the first spark of possibility. Determined to bring new perspective, he immersed himself in every document. He read the witness statements repeatedly, cross-referenced names, and mentally mapped the sequence of events. Unlike others who had moved on, Ashton treated the case as if it were alive, feeling the weight of both the victim's absence and the predator's continued freedom. Even in the quiet of his office, Ashton felt the tension of the past pressing against the present. He knew that the key to solving the case would not lie in dramatic discoveries, but in meticulous scrutiny, patience, and the willingness to question assumptions made decades earlier. The files whispered hints of truths that had been ignored, and Ashton was determined to listen. Miles Ashton began a methodical journey through every report, every note, and every interview from 1992. The files were brittle with age, the ink fading, but the details remained intact, details that had been dismissed or misunderstood decades earlier. Witness statements, timelines, and Officer Keller's initial observations were scrutinized under the lens of modern investigative thinking. Ashton knew that a fresh perspective could reveal cracks hidden in plain sight. He noted small but significant inconsistencies. A neighbor's account of noises that didn't align with the reported timeline. A delivery driver who vaguely remembered seeing Karen's car, and subtle contradictions in Wayne Pierce's story. Every seemingly minor discrepancy became a thread worth tugging. What others had labeled coincidences now demanded careful attention. Ashton also cross-referenced the statements with community records, weather reports, and the geography of the neighborhood. The early investigators had relied on assumptions of normalcy, the idea that nothing in Karen's quiet life could hint at danger. Ashton rejected that logic. He treated each detail as potentially decisive, building a mental reconstruction of the first 48 hours that may have been overlooked. With each page, the cold weight of decades pressed against him. The silence of unanswered questions, the frustration of dead ends, and the persistent absence of justice became a tangible presence in the room. Yet, amidst this weight, a spark of clarity emerged. Ashton began to see connections that had never been drawn, a chain of logic that could pierce the fog of time. The files no longer felt like relics, they were active witnesses. And as Ashton pieced together their narrative, he realized that the first cracks in the long-held assumptions were appearing. Somewhere within these aged pages lay the key to resurrecting a case that had haunted Kalamazoo for over 30 years. Miles Ashton's attention shifted to Wayne Pierce, the man whose name had been cleared decades ago. On paper, Pierce's alibi appeared solid. He had claimed to be working late in his auto shop, a story backed by his then-wife. Yet Ashton's modern perspective allowed him to see what others had missed: the subtle gaps, the assumptions, and the inconsistencies that had seemed insignificant at the time. Every detail of Pierce's account was examined. Ashton cross-referenced timelines, phone records, and statements from employees and neighbors. He noticed minor contradictions. A delivery truck logged on the street at a time Pierce claimed he was alone, a neighbor recalling hearing unusual engine noises inconsistent with normal work hours. These discrepancies, though small, hinted at the possibility that Pierce's story might not be as airtight as previously believed. Ashton also studied Pierce's demeanor in the original interviews. Confidence, calmness, and meticulousness had once been interpreted as cooperation. Now, they raised questions. Could a man so composed be masking guilt? Could a well-practiced routine have been the perfect shield for someone hiding a terrible secret? The investigator took no leaps of assumption. Every suspicion was backed by evidence and careful reasoning. Yet, the tension grew. Pierce, once dismissed as irrelevant, was now appearing at the center of the investigation through the lens of overlooked clues. The meticulous scrutiny revealed that the very alibi once taken at face value could be the thread that unraveled decades of false certainty. As Ashton continued, a quiet realization emerged. The key to the case might not lie in the grand gestures or dramatic discoveries, but in patiently dissecting the ordinary, in examining what had been accepted for too long. The cracks in Pierce's story were subtle, but with careful attention, they could widen into the opening needed to finally bring justice for Karen Umphrey. As Miles Ashton pieced together the details, a pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, then undeniable. Small inconsistencies in witness accounts, the timing of phone calls, and Pierce's own statements no longer seemed isolated. Each detail, previously dismissed as coincidence, now formed a web of uncertainty. The foundations of the original investigation were cracking under scrutiny. The realization struck Ashton with a mix of urgency and caution. If Pierce's alibi was flawed, it could explain the stalled investigation and decades of unanswered questions. Yet he knew that rushing would be dangerous. One misstep could alert the man who had lived freely for 32 years. Ashton carefully documented every discrepancy, constructing a timeline that highlighted the gaps in Pierce's story. The detective also felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Karen's family, the community, and generations of law enforcement had been left without answers. The pressure to succeed was immense, but Ashton's methodical approach balanced this urgency with meticulous planning. The first cracks in the decades-old case were the beginning of hope, but also the start of a long, tense pursuit. Even as Ashton analyzed the evidence, he felt the shadow of the past unsolved, unresolved, haunting every page of the file. The first spark of potential breakthrough illuminated the gaps that had been ignored for so long. It was clear that Pierce, once an assumed innocent, could no longer be overlooked. As the pieces fell into place, Ashton prepared for the next phase, connecting these cracks to actionable leads. The cold case was no longer frozen in time. The first signs of movement, the first glimmers of clarity, were emerging. The long silence of Karen Umphrey's murder was about to be challenged, and the possibility of justice, once faint, now felt within reach. The year was 2024, and for the first time in over 3 decades, the Karen Umphrey case was stirring to life. Investigator Miles Ashton held the fragile vial of biological evidence like a time capsule, a 2-year-old sample that had carried the secret of a murderer through decades of silence. Technology had finally caught up with ambition. Investigative Genetic Genealogy, or IGG, promised to turn that forgotten fragment into a trail of truth. Unlike traditional criminal DNA databases, IGG didn't rely on matching the sample to known offenders. Instead, it reached into the genetic footprints left by ordinary people, distant cousins, second- and third-degree relatives who had submitted their DNA to commercial genealogy sites. Each connection, no matter how remote, became a potential link in a massive family web. The science was exacting, painstaking, and uncertain. One error, one false assumption, could collapse the entire investigation. The team worked with meticulous care, aware that decades of procedural errors or hurried assumptions could not be repeated. Each strand of DNA was analyzed, each segment compared, and every potential match scrutinized. Ashton observed the process with a blend of hope and skepticism. Could technology really illuminate a crime that had resisted all efforts for 32 years? Could the invisible hand that had stolen Karen's life finally be traced? In the quiet of the lab, tension coiled tightly around the investigators. The biological sample, long dormant, now carried the weight of 32 years of unanswered questions, grief, and frustration. It had been silent, a ghost in a freezer. But the promise of IGG meant it could finally speak. and in that promise lay both hope and fear, the fear that the man who had lived freely, blending into society, might be revealed. By the end of the day, the first connections had begun to appear, fragile yet promising. The past was no longer unmovable, and the first faint light of breakthrough touched the edges of a decades-old darkness. The genetic matches began to form a complex web, each thread linking to distant relatives who had unknowingly contributed to the investigation. Miles Ashton and the team worked with painstaking precision, tracing connections through second- and third-degree relatives, piecing together a family tree that stretched across decades and towns. Every shared chromosome became a clue, narrowing the field, focusing attention on a shrinking pool of potential suspects. The process was laborious. Public records, census data, marriage certificates, and obituaries were scrutinized alongside the genetic information. Each branch of the family tree was analyzed for age, location, and opportunity, until the possibilities began to coalesce. The further the team dug, the clearer the outlines of the killer's immediate family emerged. It was no longer a faceless entity. The perpetrator now existed in a framework of identifiable people, a man shaped by real-life connections and real-life communities. As the web tightened, Ashton's focus zeroed in on the men in the generation present during Karen Umphrey's murder. Only a handful remained, all within the geographic proximity to the crime. The suspense grew. The case that had been dormant for 32 years was alive once more, teetering on the brink of revelation. As the family tree narrowed, one name began to emerge from the shadows. Wayne Pierce. A man who had once been questioned in 1992, quickly dismissed, now reappeared at the center of the investigation. The connections were undeniable. The genetic evidence pointed in his direction, and the painstaking tree building had drawn a clear line to him. Ashton studied the details with a mix of disbelief and focused determination. Wayne Pierce was not just a name on a page. He was a man with a life, a history, and a community presence. He had been part of the original investigation, presenting a calm, cooperative front, while his alibi, once trusted, now appeared fragile under the scrutiny of modern analysis. The decades had shielded him, but the meticulous work of IGG was peeling that shield away. Ashton knew the next steps required extreme caution. Any sudden move could alert Pierce, potentially jeopardizing the investigation. The team began planning discreet surveillance, monitoring his daily routines without raising suspicion. The weight of the decades of unanswered questions pressed down on everyone involved. By the end of this phase, the shadow had a shape. The invisible hand of the murderer had a name. Wayne Pierce was no longer a vague suspect. He was the focus of the hunt, the man who might finally bring closure to Karen Umphrey's family. The anticipation of what was to come held everyone in suspense, the tension growing with each passing moment. With Wayne Pierce identified as the prime candidate, the investigation entered its most delicate phase. Ashton and his team understood the stakes. One misstep could alert a man who had eluded justice for over 3 decades. Surveillance began discreetly, blending into the rhythm of everyday life. Pierce's routine was carefully monitored, every movement logged, every interaction quietly observed. The contrast between the unassuming mechanic and the dark history hidden in his past weighed heavily on the investigators. As the lab prepared to run the comparison, the team held their collective breath. For over 3 decades, Karen Umphrey's family, the city of Kalamazoo, and the detectives involved had waited for this moment. The emotional weight of potential discovery was enormous. A single report would either vindicate their efforts or return the case to cold, unyielding silence. If you're still watching and you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself why you keep taking from creators who give everything to uncover stories like this. If you're not hitting that button, at least be honest in the comments about why you refuse. Finally, the lab results arrived. The report was brief, but catastrophic. Wayne Pierce matched the DNA of subject Alpha K. 32 years of fear, grief, and unanswered questions were distilled into a single, undeniable truth. The shadow of doubt lifted, replaced by chilling certainty. The man who had walked freely, blending into the community for decades, had been exposed. The weeks of patient observation had led to this moment. Wayne Pierce, the man who had been part of Kalamazoo's background noise for decades, was now under meticulous scrutiny. Miles Ashton's team followed every routine, mapping his daily life. The early morning opening of his auto shop, the steady rhythm of customers coming and going, and the casual interactions with neighbors who had long trusted him. Ashton focused not only on Pierce's actions, but also on the inconsistencies in his original statements from 1992. The more the team studied the patterns, the more the picture of a predator disguised as a neighbor became undeniable. Every casual gesture in his modern life was now contrasted against the dark past the investigators were reconstructing. If you've followed this story this far and haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself, what would happen if someone dangerous was living next door to you and no one was paying attention? Subscribe now, and if you don't, be honest in the comments about why you chose to ignore it. The team's patience finally paid off when Pierce inadvertently left behind a small but crucial piece of evidence, a discarded coffee cup, outside the diner he frequented. It would soon provide the link needed to confirm what years of investigation had been pointing toward. The man who had haunted Kalamazoo in silence for decades was now within reach of being unmasked. The discarded coffee cup was delivered to the state lab under strict secrecy. Every step of handling, labeling, and analysis was conducted with the highest level of caution. The stakes were monumental. 32 years of unresolved grief, unanswered questions, and relentless fear rested on the results of a few cells clinging to the rim of a cup. Miles Ashton waited, pacing the small conference room at the precinct, aware that this single analysis could change everything. The lab technicians, seasoned in handling sensitive evidence, treated the sample with painstaking care, knowing that a single error could erase decades of work. Each moment was heavy with anticipation. Hours later, the lab confirmed what the team had been bracing for. The DNA profile matched subject Alpha K. Wayne Pierce, the man who had seamlessly blended into the city for over 30 years, was the genetic match. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. 32 years of silence, speculation, and fear had finally been pierced by irrefutable proof. The truth was undeniable. The man who fixed cars for neighbors, who smiled and waved at familiar faces, who attended community events and lived openly among the very people terrified by his past crime, was now exposed. The psychological weight of the revelation was immense both for the investigators and for a community that had long believed the killer had vanished or disappeared. If you've watched this far and haven't subscribed yet, think about the stories that might be out there, waiting to be told. Hit subscribe now, or at least explain in the comments why you refused, while danger remains hidden in plain sight. The stage was set. Wayne Pierce's secret, held for over 3 decades, had finally surfaced. The story was moving toward its inevitable confrontation. With the DNA match confirmed, the investigation shifted into its most delicate and high-stakes phase. Wayne Pierce, unaware that the past had finally caught up to him, continued his daily routine at the auto shop. Customers came and went, none suspecting that the man they trusted with their vehicles had been hiding a violent crime for more than 30 years. Miles Ashton and his team approached the situation with extreme caution. Any overt action could tip Pierce off and send him into hiding, potentially destroying the opportunity to finally secure justice for Karen Umphrey. Surveillance intensified. Every movement was recorded, every routine dissected for vulnerability. The tension among the team mirrored the silent dread that had gripped the city for decades. Meanwhile, in the lab, technicians finalized the full report, confirming beyond doubt that Wayne Pierce was the elusive subject Alpha K. The certainty of the match removed any room for error, any lingering doubt. The truth had been buried in decades of normalcy, Yet now it lay exposed for all who knew how to see it. This moment carried profound emotional weight. For Karen's sister, Amelia, it was a mixture of hope and grief, hope that the man responsible would finally face justice, and grief over the 32 years lost, the years of fear and uncertainty. The investigators carried their own burden, a shared responsibility for ensuring that this revelation would lead to a lawful and effective resolution. The days leading to the arrest were a careful dance of strategy and patience. Miles Ashton coordinated every detail with his tactical unit, ensuring that Wayne Pierce would be taken into custody without risk to the officers, the public, or the fragile momentum of the case. Every move was deliberate, every angle anticipated. The city that had once slept uneasily under the shadow of an unknown killer now unknowingly stood on the edge of revelation. Surveillance cameras, discreet tailing, and stakeouts became the team's tools of precision. Wayne's routines were documented in exhaustive detail: the coffee at the diner, the lunch break, the visits from friends and family. Each step confirmed what the investigators already suspected: the man had grown comfortable. Perhaps too comfortable. Living a life built on deception. The atmosphere within the investigation team was tense but electric. Decades of unresolved anguish, the pressure to act without error, and the weight of responsibility to Karen's family combined into a collective focus. Every team member understood that the arrest would not only resolve a 32-year-old crime, but also restore, even slightly, a sense of safety and closure to a shaken community. If you've stayed with this story all this way, but haven't subscribed, consider this. The next time someone dangerous walks unnoticed in your neighborhood, will you be ready? Subscribe now, or at least admit in the comments why you chose not to. The morning of the confrontation arrived with cold, gray skies, a fitting backdrop for a case that had haunted Kalamazoo for over 3 decades. Miles Ashton's tactical unit moved with precision toward Wayne Pierce's auto shop. The man who had fixed countless vehicles for unsuspecting neighbors was now about to face the culmination of 32 years of investigation. Pierce, beneath the grease-stained coveralls and the familiar routines of his workday, was unaware of the net closing around him. Every tool in the shop, every movement he made, was now part of a scene meticulously observed by law enforcement professionals who knew the depth of his deception. The tension inside the unit was suffocating. One wrong step could jeopardize justice for Karen Umphrey and her family. When the officers finally moved in, the scene was a stark contrast to the ordinary life Pierce had carefully maintained. The arrest was swift, silent, and unyielding. No resistance, no dramatic escape, just the undeniable moment of accountability that had eluded the city for decades. Wayne Pierce, once a faceless shadow in the community, now confronted the consequences of his actions. The mask was gone. The truth, undeniable. 32 years of waiting, investigation, and fear had led to this ultimate revelation. Wayne Pierce, once invisible, was finally exposed. Wayne Pierce's life after 1992 appeared ordinary, even commendable. He worked tirelessly at his auto shop, slowly climbing the ranks to become a respected figure in Kalamazoo's mechanic community. Customers trusted him without hesitation, often returning for years for advice, repairs, or just a friendly conversation. Friends and neighbors would nod politely when he passed, unaware that behind the grease-stained hands and approachable smile lay the man who had robbed Karen Umphrey of her life. His weekdays were a careful choreography of normalcy, opening the shop at dawn, greeting the morning customers, working on engines with precise, practiced hands. On weekends, he appeared almost wholesome, tending to small errands, visiting local stores, and occasionally chatting with neighbors on leisurely walks. Every interaction reinforced the illusion of a man dedicated to his craft and his community. For investigators, retracing Wayne's daily life was a mix of admiration for his cunning and revulsion at the audacity. The very routines that had earned him respect became chilling evidence of how seamlessly a predator can blend into society. Each handshake, each casual wave, was now reframed in the context of the crime that had remained unsolved for over 3 decades. Even as investigators prepare for the arrest, the psychological weight of Wayne's decades of deception presses down on everyone who uncovers the details. The community had unknowingly lived alongside a man who had shattered a life and left fear rippling silently for years. Wayne Pierce moved through Kalamazoo with the ease of a man who knew he was invisible. Weekdays blurred into weekends, and the people around him had no reason to suspect the darkness that lingered in his past. He attended community events, waved to familiar faces, and offered casual advice on car troubles, reinforcing the image of a helpful, reliable neighbor. To them, he was ordinary, perhaps even admirable. Investigators followed these routines closely, tracing every public interaction. Each handshake and smile became a chilling testament to Wayne's skill in masking guilt. He had built a life where ordinary actions erased suspicion, where friendliness acted as camouflage. For the community, every encounter was a reassurance. For the detectives, it was a stark reminder of how calculated evil can hide in plain sight. Amelia Umphrey often reflected on this silent terror. The knowledge that the man who had destroyed her sister's life had shared sidewalks, stores, and social gatherings with ordinary citizens was almost unbearable. The same man could greet her friends, neighbors, and coworkers without a flicker of recognition or remorse. His life had been a continuous performance, perfected over decades, exploiting the trust of those around him. For investigators and Amelia Umphrey, the realization of Wayne Pierce's decades-long facade was suffocating. Every mundane detail of his life, the early morning coffee runs, the friendly nods to neighbors, the weekends spent tinkering in his garage, was now a chilling reminder that the man who had taken Karen's life had never faced consequence. The quiet horror of this truth pressed on their minds, a weight that had been growing for 32 years, now fully tangible. The detective team reviewed old footage, witness statements, and public appearances, seeing in hindsight how perfectly Wayne had manipulated perception. Each smile, each casual greeting, each ordinary interaction was proof of his audacity. The man who had disappeared from their radar was the same man who had slipped seamlessly into the rhythm of the city, unchallenged and unobserved. Amelia's pain was compounded by this normalcy. The sister who had once campaigned tirelessly for justice could now only stare at the unsettling knowledge that her community had unknowingly coexisted with a killer. The fear that had haunted Kalamazoo was no longer an abstract shadow. It had a name, a face, and decades of hidden movement through everyday life. As the investigation tightened, every move Wayne Pierce made became a ticking clock. Surveillance teams tracked his routine meticulously, cataloging hours spent at the shop, interactions with neighbors, and weekend errands. Each recorded moment underscored a horrifying truth. The man who had destroyed a life had done so while living openly, comfortably, and without fear of consequence. Investigators felt the pressure of decades of waiting. Every step had to be precise, every action deliberate, because even a small miscalculation could tip off Wayne and erase 32 years of painstaking work. The tension was almost unbearable, a constant hum beneath every scene. One wrong move, and the moment for justice would slip away again. Amelia watched the developments unfold with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The years of uncertainty, therapy sessions, and quiet grief had prepared her only partially for this moment. The idea that the killer, once a faceless, distant phantom, was now fully known, ready to be confronted, stirred a storm of emotions. Anger, relief, fear, and anticipation mingled in her chest, demanding acknowledgement and action. If this kind of hidden darkness terrifies you, don't just scroll away. Subscribe. Because staying silent doesn't protect you. It only protects the monsters who count on your silence. The stage is now set. Wayne Pierce's years of hidden life are about to meet the long-overdue reckoning, and the community's collective shock is waiting just around the corner. The first light of dawn struggled through the gray Michigan sky, casting a cold, uneasy glow over Kalamazoo. Silence hung heavier than usual, broken only by the distant hum of morning traffic. At the Northside Auto Shop, Wayne Pierce bent under the hood of a truck, completely unaware that decades of evasion were about to end. For 32 years, he had carried himself as any ordinary man would. Friendly nods to neighbors, casual small talk with customers, a grandfatherly grin for his grandchildren. Yet, beneath that familiar exterior, the truth waited to collide with him. Outside, a tactical unit assembled with quiet precision. Captain Miles Ashton's team moved like shadows, careful not to alert the man they had been hunting for over 3 decades. Every step was measured, every command deliberate. The anticipation was almost suffocating, the tension stretching taut like a wire ready to snap. 32 years of grief, doubt, and fear had led to this moment a convergence of patience, science, and relentless pursuit. Then, without warning, the arrest unfolded. Wayne Pierce straightened, hands slick with oil, only to be met by the presence of uniformed officers. In a few swift motions, cuffs were applied. The quiet, ordinary man who had lived seamlessly among them now bore the weight of undeniable truth. His life of deception had ended not with drama, but with the cold, absolute authority of justice. If the thought of a predator walking freely in your community terrifies you, subscribe now. If you don't, at least tell us in the comments why you refuse, because ignoring it won't protect you. The arrest was complete. The calm of the morning shattered, leaving in its place a tense, collective gasp from a city that had carried this invisible terror for too long. Dawn had broken, and with it, the truth. By mid-morning, the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Office had transformed into a theater of anticipation. Reporters, neighbors, and city officials packed the room, their eyes scanning for any sign of what was to come. Cameras clicked incessantly, A-team, recording the tension that had gripped the community for over 3 decades. At the podium stood Captain Miles Ashton, his face tight with the weight of responsibility. Amelia Umphrey, by his side, a living reminder of the human cost behind the headlines. Ashton cleared his throat, his voice firm but trembling ever so slightly. Today, September 13th, 1992, is finally over, he began. The words reverberated through the room, a declaration that had been impossible for 32 long years. The crowd held its breath, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and anger coiling in the silent space. He carefully recounted the investigation, bridging the gap between the events of that fateful September day and the tireless work that had finally led to justice. Then came the revelation. Wayne Pierce, once just a name on a file, now stood as the undeniable link to Karen Umphrey's murder. Murmurs swelled into gasps, some faces twisted in shock, others in the grim satisfaction of a truth finally exposed. The ordinary man who had mingled with the community, attended local events, and offered a friendly smile had been unmasked. Each sentence Ashton spoke peeled back layers of disbelief. The crowd's collective consciousness struggled to reconcile the man they had seen for years with the monster revealed in the DNA. Every neighbor, coworker, and passerby was forced to confront the chilling reality. Evil had lived among them, hidden in plain sight. The announcement was not just about closure. It was a mirror held up to a city that had unknowingly shared its streets with a predator. And yet, for Amelia, the news was a small step toward reclaiming a sense of control lost so many years ago. Amelia Umphrey stepped forward, her hands trembling, but her voice carried a weight that demanded attention. 32 years of unanswered questions, of living with the void left by her sister, had sharpened her resolve. Every syllable she spoke cut through the thick air of disbelief that filled the room. "We didn't get justice today," she said, her tone steady but raw. "We got the first step toward accountability. Justice for Karen was taken on September 13th, 1992. Amelia's recounting of the past decades reminded everyone that the pain of a cold case does not end with evidence. It lingers in the spaces between daily life, in family gatherings, and in the quiet corners of homes where fear once resided. She spoke of candlelight vigils held year after year, the questions she had asked over and over, and the nights she spent wondering if anyone would ever be held accountable. Her words also carried a stark warning. The threat of unseen predators is never abstract. The same streets, homes, and communities we take for granted may harbor hidden dangers. This was not merely a story from the past, it was a call to vigilance. Outside the sheriff's office, the city of Kalamazoo seemed suspended in disbelief. News of Wayne Pierce's arrest traveled faster than the morning wind, shaking the tight-knit community to its core. Neighbors whispered in stunned tones, struggling to reconcile the friendly, familiar man they had known for decades with the predator unmasked by modern science. Some refused to believe it. Others stared in silent horror, the realization that evil had been living among them for 32 years, settling like a weight on their chests. The ripple effects reached every corner of the city. Customers of Pierce's auto shop recoiled as they recounted their past interactions, the handshakes, the helpful advice, the casual jokes. Everyone suddenly questioned what they thought they knew, and the idea that familiarity could hide such darkness left an indelible mark. Children who once waved at him on the street were now faced with the terrifying truth that monsters can wear ordinary faces. Local media descended on Kalamazoo like a swarm, documenting every detail, replaying every fact from 1992, and juxtaposing it with the breakthrough that finally led to justice. Experts were brought in to explain the significance of investigative genetic genealogy. Yet, even the science could not fully ease the unsettling revelation. A person could be a killer and yet live an entire life in plain sight. The emotional impact was palpable. Families who had felt secure in their neighborhoods now faced the haunting question: who else might be hiding behind a familiar smile? The arrest did not erase fear. It sharpened it, a grim reminder that vigilance and accountability are necessary every day. For over 3 decades, Kalamazoo carried the shadow of Karen Umphrey's absence. Families who had once felt safe on quiet streets lived with an invisible tension, each neighbor quietly aware that a predator had once walked freely among them. Detective Victor Albright, long retired, often revisited the case in his mind, recalling the sleepless nights and the moments of despair when hope seemed impossible. The community's fear had softened over time, but the sting of uncertainty never faded. 32 years of waiting left deep emotional scars on Amelia Umphrey and those close to Karen. Every anniversary brought a renewed sense of grief, a reminder that the killer remained at large while life carried on for everyone else. The absence of closure weighed heavily, shaping relationships, trust, and the collective psyche of the city. Parents questioned who could truly be trusted. Friends revisited conversations from the past, wondering if subtle clues had been missed. The emotional cost of waiting decades for justice became almost tangible, a quiet, gnawing presence that accompanied daily life. Yet, this long wait also revealed the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the overwhelming weight of fear and uncertainty, Amelia kept Karen's memory alive. Candlelight vigils, community memorials, and conversations with younger generations ensured the story endured. Even in darkness, the truth remained a persistent spark, waiting for the right time, the right tools, and the right determination to finally bring justice. Before you leave, subscribe unless you want to join the list of people who watched an entire story of pain, fear, and justice, and still walked away without supporting the channel that told it. If you won't subscribe, explain your reason in the comments. We'll all be waiting. Karen Umphrey's case was a testament to the leaps in forensic science over the past 3 decades. In 1992, the technology available to investigators was rudimentary. DNA testing was in its infancy, and databases were limited. The tiny biological sample collected at the crime scene held the killer's identity. But back then, it was essentially a locked vault, with no key. Detectives could only hope that one day, science would advance enough to open it. Fast forward to the 2022. Investigative genetic genealogy had become a revolutionary tool, capable of connecting the smallest fragment of DNA to an entire family tree. The same sample that had taunted investigators for 32 years now became the instrument of truth. Captain Miles Ashton's team combined careful detective work with cutting-edge science, tracing distant relatives, cross-referencing public records, and narrowing down possibilities until only one name remained. The breakthrough was not instantaneous. It required patience, precision, and a relentless commitment to justice. This evolution of forensics highlights a critical lesson. Crimes thought unsolvable are often only delayed by the limitations of the era. Modern technology does more than catch criminals, it provides closure to survivors, vindication for law enforcement, and a warning to those who assume time can shield them from accountability. The case of Wayne Pierce illustrates that even decades of hiding cannot outpace the meticulous march of scientific progress. Even after Wayne Pierce was finally arrested, the wounds left on Karen Umphrey's family and the Kalamazoo community did not heal instantly. Decades of fear, uncertainty, and grief had become part of daily life. Amelia Umphrey, now middle-aged, carried the weight of 32 years of unanswered questions. Every familiar face, every neighbor she had trusted, was a reminder that the man responsible had been walking freely among them all this time. The community, too, felt the shock reverberate. Friends and neighbors who once greeted Pierce warmly now struggled to reconcile the friendly mechanic with the cold-blooded killer revealed by DNA. The realization that someone could live a normal life while hiding such violence shook the city's sense of safety to its core. Ordinary routines, grocery trips, walks in local parks, casual conversations now carried an unspoken tension. People became hyper-aware that evil can wear the face of normality, and trust could no longer be given blindly. Yet, amidst the fear and anger, the arrest offered a sliver of relief. Amelia, and those who loved Karen, could finally feel that justice had a tangible form, a man in custody, accountable for his actions. While it could never bring Karen back, it marked the end of decades-long uncertainty and the start of a slow, painful healing process. The emotional scars remained, but the knowledge that the perpetrator would face the consequences offered a degree of closure that had eluded them for generations. Kalamazoo would never see its neighborhoods the same way again. The arrest of Wayne Pierce shattered the comforting illusion that danger only existed far from home. Residents who once waved at him, invited him to community events, or entrusted him with daily errands now faced a stark truth. The threat had been among them all along. Fear, once abstract, became concrete, and trust was forever recalibrated. Local businesses, schools, and social circles grappled with the revelation. Conversations that once revolved around mundane daily life now carried the weight of suspicion and retrospection. How could a man lead an ordinary life while committing such a crime? The community's reckoning was not just about justice for Karen, but also about understanding how easily someone with a hidden darkness could hide in plain sight. Amelia Umphrey became a quiet symbol for the city, embodying resilience amid heartbreak. Her public appearances reminded everyone that the consequences of violent acts ripple far beyond the victim. Families reflected on their routines, neighbors reconsidered their assumptions, and a subtle, lasting anxiety settled over the city. This reckoning also underscored a critical lesson: awareness and vigilance matter. The world is not inherently safe, and complacency can allow monsters to hide unnoticed. The arrest was a reminder that even after decades, accountability could arrive, forcing communities to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, appearances, and justice. The Karen Umphrey case leaves a lasting imprint, a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces. 32 years of unanswered questions, fear, and grief culminated in Wayne Pierce's arrest, but the emotional echoes linger. Kalamazoo learned that justice, while delayed, can still arrive, though it never fully restores what was taken. For Amelia, the victory was bittersweet. Relief mixed with sorrow, a recognition that no sentence could fill the void left by her sister's absence. The city itself learned a similar lesson. The true horror of violence isn't always in the act itself, but in the years of uncertainty and the invisible presence of someone who deceives everyone. The arrest didn't erase the past, it reframed it, offering accountability instead of endless speculation. This story serves as a call to awareness. The hidden threats in our communities are not always strangers in the night. They might be neighbors, coworkers, or people we see every day. Karen's tragedy reminds us that vigilance, justice, and the relentless pursuit of truth are the only defenses against those who hide behind normalcy. Before you leave, subscribe, unless you want to join the list of people who watched an entire story of pain, fear, and justice, and still walked away without supporting the channel that told it. If you won't subscribe, explain your reason in the comments. We'll all be waiting. As the screen fades, viewers are left with one undeniable fact. Accountability may take decades, but when it arrives, its impact is unforgettable. Karen's story is a permanent mark on Kalamazoo, a lesson in patience, justice, and the human cost of unresolved crimes. The light finally shone on a darkness that hid for too long, leaving a warning that will echo through the lives of all who hear it.